The smallest hand in the royal nursery went cold, and the first person they blamed was the only one who loved him like a child instead of a crown. Grace Miller stood beside Prince Oliver Winterbourne's bed with a gray wool blanket clutched in both hands, unable to understand how the quiet night had turned into a room full of suspicion. Snow tapped softly against the tall nursery windows, each flake catching the candlelight before vanishing into the dark beyond the glass. Only 20 minutes ago, the little prince had been awake, sleepy-eyed and stubborn, insisting that the blue blanket was warmer than the white one even though both came from the same cedar chest. Grace had smiled, poured his thin honey tea, and promised him the moon would still be outside his window when he woke. Now Oliver lay too still against the pillows, his pale face turned toward the fire, his small fingers curled loosely over the embroidered sheet. Royal healers moved around him in hushed urgency, checking his pulse, smelling the teacup, whispering words Grace could not catch. Guards stood at the nursery doors. Court ladies gathered in silk robes hastily thrown over evening gowns. Every face looked frightened, but only one face looked ready. Lady Victoria Hale stepped from the foot of the bed in a cream satin dress, her silver blonde hair pinned perfectly despite the hour, and pointed one delicate finger at Grace. She was the last one who touched the heir's cup. The words struck the room harder than a shout. Grace felt every gaze turned toward her, sharp, fast, relieved to have a shape for their fear. She looked down at the tea stain on her gray apron, a small amber mark near the pocket where Oliver had bumped the tray while reaching for his wooden wolf toy. It had seemed like nothing then. A clumsy, sleepy child, a quiet laugh, Grace dabbing the cloth with the corner of her sleeve. Now the stain looked like evidence to people who had never noticed her unless something needed cleaning. "I prepared his tea the same way I always do," Grace said, her voice soft but steady enough to surprise her. "Honey, warm water, and lavender. Nothing else." A healer lifted the cup and frowned. "There is a bitter scent beneath the honey." A murmur moved through the nursery. Grace's stomach tightened. "That is not possible." Lady Victoria stepped closer, her expression arranged into sorrow. "Grace, no one wants to believe this. But the prince grew weak after drinking what you gave him. You were alone with him." Alone with him. As if all the nights she had sat beside Oliver through storms, nightmares, and lonely birthdays had become a crime by being witnessed only by a child. Grace looked at the boy on the bed, and fear rose so quickly it almost stole her breath. Not fear for herself. Not yet. Fear that Oliver would open his eyes and find the room angry, frightened, and loud. He hated loud rooms. He would reach for her first. He always did. "Please," Grace whispered to the nearest healer. "He likes the blue blanket. If he wakes and sees strangers, he will be scared." The healer glanced at her with pity that faded into caution. Before he could answer, Victoria reached toward Grace's apron pocket and drew out a small glass vial. Grace froze. The vial was familiar and wrong at the same time. It had the same plain cork she used for nursery lavender, but the liquid inside was darker, with a faint green tint that made her skin prickle. "What is this?" Victoria asked, though the question sounded practiced. Grace stared at it. "That is not mine. It was in your pocket. I did not put it there." The words sounded weak even to her own ears, not because they were false, but because truth spoken by an Omega servant had always needed someone stronger to carry it before court believed it. One of the healers took the vial, uncorked it, and went very still. "Winterbane," he said. The nursery seemed to lose all warmth. A court lady gasped. A guard shifted closer. Grace's hands went numb around the blanket. Winterbane was forbidden near children, forbidden near royal blood, forbidden in every nursery from Silverpine to the Northern Crown. She had never touched it in her life. Lady Victoria lowered her eyes. The Alpha King must be told. At the mention of King Caleb Winterbourne, even the fire seemed to quiet. Grace had seen him only from a distance. Tall, white-skinned, wrapped in black and silver, cold as the northern mountains, a father whose tenderness existed only in the way he looked at his son when he thought no one saw. Oliver was his heir, his bloodline, his last soft place in a kingdom built from ice and discipline. If Caleb believed Grace had harmed him, no one in the palace would speak for her. No one except the small boy who could not wake. Grace stepped toward the bed, but a guard lifted a hand to stop her. That simple motion hurt more than accusation. She had tucked Oliver in every night for 2 years. Now she was too dangerous to stand beside him. On the pillow, the prince's lashes fluttered faintly. Grace saw it and forgot the guards, the vial, the court ladies, the fear closing around her name. "Oliver," she breathed. His lips parted, but no sound came. Then the nursery doors opened, and the cold of the northern hall swept in before the king himself crossed the threshold. King Caleb Winterborn did not need to raise his voice to change the room. He only stepped into the nursery, and every whisper folded into silence. Snow clung to the shoulders of his black coat, the silver embroidery catching candlelight like frost on a blade, while his storm blue eyes moved once across the scene before settling on the bed. Grace saw the moment his control tightened. It was not dramatic. His face did not break. His posture did not falter. But something in the air changed when he looked at Oliver, as if the entire palace had been built around the small rise and fall of that child's breathing. Caleb crossed the room with measured steps, tall and cold and terrifyingly calm. The healers bowed back from the bed. Lady Victoria lowered her head. The guards straightened. Grace remained near the foot of the bed with the gray blanket still in her hands, unable to look away from Oliver's pale face. The king touched 2 fingers lightly to his son's wrist, then looked at the healer, holding the vial. "Report." The healer swallowed. "The prince weakened shortly after drinking his night tea, Your Majesty. There is a bitter scent in the cup, and this vial was found in the servant's apron." Grace flinched at the word servant, though it was not untrue. It was just never all she had been to Oliver. Caleb took the vial, but did not open it. His gaze moved to Grace, and the weight of it nearly stopped her breath. "You prepared his tea?" She forced herself to answer. "Yes, Your Majesty." A court lady inhaled sharply, as if Grace had confessed. Lady Victoria closed her eyes in solemn grief, too perfect by half. Caleb's eyes remained on Grace. "Were you alone with him?" Grace felt the room waiting for her to save herself with a lie. She could not. "Yes." The word hurt. "I was reading to him. He asked for honey tea and the blue blanket. He was tired, but he was laughing. He knocked the tray with his toy wolf. That is how the tea stained my apron." Caleb looked at the amber mark, then at her hands. They were trembling, not reaching for escape, not hiding the pocket where the vial had been found. Trembling toward the child. He noticed. Grace did not know he noticed, but his eyes narrowed by the smallest measure. Lady Victoria stepped forward. "Your Majesty, Grace has been close to the prince for some time. Too close, perhaps. Children become attached to gentle voices, even when those voices hide dangerous intentions." Grace turned toward her, stunned by the smooth cruelty of it. "I would never harm him." "Then why carry Winterbane?" Victoria asked softly. "I did not." The answer came out thinner than Grace wanted. She hated that. She hated how fear could make truth sound guilty. Caleb turned to the healer. "Is Winterbane confirmed?" "By scent, yes. A full test will take time." "Then do not call it confirmed." The healer bowed at once. The room shifted, surprised by the correction. Grace felt it too, a small break in the wall closing around her. Caleb looked back at her. "What should have been in the vial?" "Lavender," Grace said quickly. "A mild nursery blend. Oliver has nightmares when the wind rattles the windows. Lavender helps him sleep." At the sound of his name, Oliver stirred faintly. Grace took half a step before the guard moved again, blocking her path. She stopped, pain flickering across her face before she could hide it. Caleb saw that too. "Let her speak from there," he said. The guard lowered his hand, but did not move away. Grace clasped the blanket tighter. "Oliver," she whispered, soft enough for a bedtime room, not a court. "It is Grace. You are safe. The moon is still outside your window." The nursery held its breath. For one fragile second, the little prince's lashes trembled. His fingers shifted against the sheet, reaching weakly toward the sound. Grace's eyes filled, but she kept her voice steady. "That is it, little wolf. Just rest." Caleb watched his son's hand move toward the omega everyone had begun to condemn, and something colder than anger settled behind his eyes. Not at her. At the room. Lady Victoria must have sensed the shift, because she spoke quickly. "Your Majesty, emotional attachment is not evidence of innocence. The heir is vulnerable. He may reach for what is familiar even when it has harmed him." Caleb did not answer at once. He looked at Oliver's hand, at Grace's tears held back by sheer will, at the vial that might not yet be what they claimed. Then he asked the question no one else had asked. Who touched the cup after she prepared it? Silence moved through the nursery. A healer looked toward the tea table. A court lady lowered her gaze. Victoria's expression stayed composed, but her fingers tightened around the pearl trim of her sleeve. Grace looked up slowly. She had been so focused on Oliver that she had not seen the shape of the missing question until Caleb placed it before them. The king turned toward the entire room, voice quiet as falling snow. Before anyone in my palace condemns the woman my son is trying to reach, I will know every hand that came near that cup. The question Caleb asked did what fear had not allowed the room to do. It made everyone remember the tea table. Grace looked toward it now, a small round table near the nursery fire, with the honey jar still open, a silver spoon resting on a saucer, and Oliver's wooden wolf lying where he had dropped it before asking for his blanket. Everything looked ordinary, almost painfully gentle, and that was what made the accusation feel more terrible. A child's bedtime had been turned into a trial. Caleb stood between the bed and the watching court, the vial in one hand, his voice calm enough to force obedience from every trembling witness. Answer in order. The cup was prepared by Grace Miller. Who touched it next? The youngest nursery maid, Ella, swallowed hard. I carried the tray from the warming stand to the little table, Your Majesty. Miss Grace was folding the blue blanket. Grace nodded quickly. Yes. I asked Ella to bring it closer because Oliver wanted to sit by the fire. Caleb's gaze moved to Ella. Did you add anything? No, Your Majesty. Only the honey was already in the cup. Who added the honey? Grace said, I did. Lady Victoria's voice slid in, soft as silk. And the vial was found in her apron, Your Majesty. The chain remained simple. Caleb turned his head just enough to silence her without a word. Victoria lowered her eyes. The nursery maid continued, encouraged by the king's patience. After I set down the tray, Lady Victoria came to check on the prince. She said the room was too cold and moved near the table to close the curtain. Grace's breath caught. She remembered that moment now. The window had been cracked open, letting in a thin thread of snow-scented air. Victoria had smiled and said royal children should not sleep in drafts. Grace had thanked her, because gratitude came easily when you were trained to accept any kindness from those above you. Caleb's eyes sharpened. Lady Victoria touched the table. Ella's face went pale. She stood beside it, Your Majesty. I did not see her touch the cup. Victoria gave a quiet, wounded laugh. Closing a curtain is hardly a crime. No one said it was, Caleb replied. His calm made her smile fade. He turned to the healer. Test the liquid in the vial. Test the tea. Test the honey. And bring the lavender from the nursery stores. The healer hurried to obey. Grace stayed where she was, the blanket pressed to her chest. Every instinct in her wanted to move closer to Oliver. His breathing had become uneven again, each small inhale making the room tighten around him. She looked at Caleb, almost pleading without words. He saw it. After a moment, he said, You may stand at the bedside. Do not touch him unless I permit it. It was not warmth, but it was trust enough to let her breathe. Grace crossed the few feet to Oliver's bed, careful, slow, watched by guards and court ladies as though one wrong step might condemn her all over again. She knelt beside the mattress and laid the blue blanket over the edge, close enough for him to feel if he woke. I am here, she whispered. Not too close. Just here. Oliver's eyelids fluttered. His fingers shifted, searching. Grace held her own hands still in her lap, because the king had said not to touch him, and she would not betray the first fragment of fairness she had been given. The old royal healer returned with 3 small testing stones and the nursery lavender jar. He worked quickly, dropping a little tea, a little vial liquid, and a bit of honey onto the stones. One stayed clear. One clouded green. One turned faintly silver. His face changed. Caleb noticed before anyone else. Speak. The healer bowed, shaken. The vial contains winterbane, but the tea carries only a trace. Enough to weaken, not enough to explain the full reaction. There is something else at work, Your Majesty. A murmur rose, frightened and confused. Grace looked down at Oliver. Something else. His skin was too cool, his breathing too fragile. The accusation, the vial, the room full of suspicion all blurred beneath one terrible truth. The child was still slipping away from them. The lavender? Caleb asked. The healer opened the nursery jar, then stopped. This is not lavender. Grace's head snapped up. What? He held out the jar. The scent has been masked. The true lavender is missing. Victoria's eyes flickered toward the flowers near the tea cabinet. It was brief, but Grace saw it. So did Caleb. Before he could speak, Oliver moved. His tiny hand lifted from the sheet, weak and trembling, and reached blindly toward Grace. This time, she forgot the room. "Please," she whispered to Caleb, tears breaking free at last. "He is scared." Caleb looked at his son's hand reaching for the accused omega, then at Grace's face, where fear for herself had vanished completely beneath fear for the boy. Slowly, he gave one nod. Grace took Oliver's hand in both of hers. It was cold enough to break her heart. "Stay with us, little prince," she whispered, her tears falling before she could stop them. "Please stay." One tear slipped from her cheek and landed on the back of Oliver's hand. For a breath, nothing happened. Then silver light bloomed beneath her tear, like moonlight waking under skin. The silver light spread slowly at first, no brighter than a candle reflected in water, but every person in the nursery felt the moment it changed. It moved from Grace's tear across the back of Oliver's hand, then beneath his skin in delicate threads, tracing his small fingers with moonlit warmth. Grace froze, still holding his hand, afraid that even breathing too hard might break whatever impossible mercy had begun. The room had gone silent. No court lady whispered. No guard shifted. Even the fire seemed to lower itself, as if the flames were bowing to something older than royal law. Oliver's breath, which had been uneven and thin, caught once, then steadied. A faint color returned to his cheeks. His fingers curled around Grace's hand with more strength than before. Grace stared through her tears, unable to understand. She had not cast a spell. She had not reached for power. She had only begged a frightened child to stay. "What is happening?" Lady Victoria whispered, but no one answered her. The old royal healer took one step closer, then stopped as if approaching a sacred altar. His eyes widened behind his spectacles. "Moonlight," he breathed. "True moonlight." Caleb did not move. He stood at the bedside, tall and still in black and silver, but the cold king everyone feared had vanished from his eyes. In his place was a father watching his child return to him one breath at a time. Grace saw that look and almost looked away. It felt too private, too human, too painful to witness. Oliver's lashes fluttered. His lips parted. A small sound escaped him, weak but real. "Grace." The word broke something open inside her. A sob rose in her throat, but she pressed it down, smiling through tears she could no longer stop. "I am here," she whispered. "I am right here." The silver glow brightened at the sound of her voice, warming Oliver's hand, then fading gently into his wrist like snow melting into spring water. The healer finally reached the bed and checked the prince with shaking hands. He listened to Oliver's breathing, touched his forehead, then looked at Caleb with disbelief and reverence tangled together. "His pulse is stabilizing, Your Majesty." "The reaction is retreating." A stunned murmur passed through the nursery. The same people who had stared at Grace as if guilt clung to her dress now stared as if they feared they had nearly condemned something holy. Grace did not feel holy. She felt exhausted, terrified, and so relieved that her body could barely hold the feeling. She loosened her grip at once, remembering Caleb's permission had been for comfort, not for whatever this was. But Oliver held on. His small hand would not let her go. Caleb noticed. Everyone did. For the first time since entering the room, the Alpha King's composure almost broke. His jaw tightened, not with anger, but with a restraint too deep for words. He looked at Grace, and there was no accusation left in him. Only questions, awe, and a carefulness that made her chest ache. "Did you know you could do this?" he asked quietly. Grace shook her head. "No, Your Majesty. I swear I did not." Lady Victoria recovered enough to speak, her voice thin. It could be some trick, a distraction. If she placed the winter bane, perhaps she also prepared a cure. Caleb's gaze turned to her, and the room seemed to lose several degrees of warmth. A cure hidden in tears. Victoria's mouth closed. The healer straightened, still pale with wonder. "This is no ordinary cure. I have read of it only in old northern records. Moon-blessed omegas were said to heal through pure emotional bond, not command, not ritual. The gift responds to love without possession, grief without selfishness, and mercy without calculation." Every word landed around Grace like a language she had never been allowed to learn about herself. Moon-blessed Omega. She wanted to reject it because it sounded too large, too impossible, too dangerous for someone who owned 3 plain dresses and slept in a narrow servant room near the nursery stairs. But Oliver's hand remained warm in hers. His breathing remained steady, and the silver light, though fading, left a tiny crescent shimmer on the back of her wrist. Caleb saw it. His eyes lowered to the mark, then lifted to her face. Something unreadable moved through him, deep and controlled. The healer turned toward the tea table again, suddenly purposeful. If the child is stabilizing, we can test the hidden substances more clearly. The false lavender jar, the vial, the cup, and the flowers near the cabinet. At the word flowers, Victoria's gaze flicked again. This time half the room saw it. Grace saw Caleb see it, and understood that the miracle had not ended the danger. It had only forced the truth into the light. Oliver shifted against the pillow, still weak, but awake enough to turn his face toward the woman in the cream satin dress. His small voice trembled. She changed the bottle. The nursery held its breath. Grace felt Oliver's fingers tighten around hers. Caleb stepped closer to his son, his voice low and gentle in a way Grace had never imagined from him. "Who did, Oliver?" The little prince lifted his free hand and pointed across the room. Not at Grace. At Lady Victoria. For a moment, Lady Victoria Hale seemed to forget how to breathe. The little prince's hand remained lifted, fragile but certain, pointing across the nursery with all the strength his small body could spare. No one moved. The accusation had not come from Grace, not from a servant desperate to save herself, not from a healer trying to explain the impossible. It had come from Oliver Winterbourne, the heir every person in that room claimed to protect. Victoria's face softened at once, but this time the sorrow arrived too late to look real. "Sweet prince," she whispered, taking one careful step forward. "You are confused. You have been very ill." Oliver pressed closer to Grace's hand. His voice was faint, but the room leaned toward it. "I saw you." Grace's heart twisted. She wanted to shield him from the weight of adult lies, from the cold focus of the court, from the way Victoria's eyes sharpened behind her gentle mask. But Oliver did not look away. The blue blanket covered him to the chest, his cheeks still pale, his lashes heavy, yet there was something brave in the way he held to the truth. Caleb saw it too. His expression became very still. "No one will question my son as if his weakness makes him foolish," he said. The words were calm, but they closed every mouth in the room. The old healer moved to the flowers near the tea cabinet, the same white winter roses Victoria had stood beside earlier. He lifted the vase, then paused. Behind it, tucked into the shadow between the cabinet and the wall, was a small corked bottle wrapped in a strip of blue nursery cloth. Grace recognized the cloth immediately. It came from the basket near Oliver's blankets. Her stomach tightened as the healer brought it forward. "Lavender," he said after opening it. "The true nursery blend." Another healer compared it with the vial from Grace's apron and the jar from the shelf. The labels were switched. A low murmur spread through the nursery. Caleb looked at Victoria, and this time there was no room left for performance. "You were seen near the table. You were seen near the flowers. The true lavender was hidden where you stood. My son saw you change the bottle." Victoria's composure trembled, but she still held herself upright. "I wanted to protect him." The excuse sounded thin in the candlelit room. "From what?" Caleb asked. Victoria's gaze flicked toward Grace, and for the first time, the bitterness beneath her polished beauty showed plainly. "From her influence." The prince trusted in Omega more than his own court. He reached for her before nurses, before healers, before blood. It was improper. Grace felt the words land with a dull ache. Not because they were true, but because they revealed how easily tenderness could offend those who mistook rank for love. "So you placed forbidden herbs in a child's tea to remove the woman he trusted," Caleb said. His voice did not rise, and somehow that made it worse. Victoria's eyes filled with tears. "I never meant for him to suffer. Only to make her leave the nursery. The dose was small. It should have only frightened everyone." Grace looked down at Oliver's hand in hers. A small dose. A small lie. A small cruelty. People who never carried the consequences always called them small. Oliver's fingers tightened, and Grace smoothed the edge of the blanket with her free hand. "He is 6 years old," she said softly. The room turned to her. Grace had not meant to speak, but now that the words had come, she could not take them back. He should not have had to be brave so adults would believe what kindness already proved. Victoria looked away. The healers lowered their eyes. Even some of the court ladies seemed ashamed. Caleb's gaze rested on Grace, and something in it shifted, not pity, not gratitude alone, but recognition. The old healer stepped closer with his notes. Your Majesty, the prince will recover if the moon-blessed reaction continues to stabilize his system. We should keep him warm and calm. No more raised voices. Caleb nodded once. Then the nursery will become quiet. He looked to the guards. Escort Lady Victoria to the council chamber. She will answer under royal law, away from my son's bedside. The guards moved with formal restraint. Victoria did not resist. As she passed Grace, her eyes flicked to the faint crescent shimmer on Grace's wrist. Fear crossed her face then, deeper than shame. She had tried to remove a servant and uncovered something ancient instead. When the doors closed behind her, the nursery seemed to exhale. Grace expected relief, but what came first was trembling. The accusation had ended too quickly for her body to understand she was safe. She loosened her hold on Oliver's hand, but he would not let go. Do not go, he whispered. Grace bent closer, tears returning despite her effort to stop them. I am here. Caleb stood on the other side of the bed, watching his son hold the hand of the Omega he had almost lost to a lie. Slowly, he removed his black gloves and set them aside. Miss Miller, he said, his voice lower now, no longer for the court. You were accused of taking life from this room. Before all of us, you gave it back. Grace looked up at him through silver-lit tears. On her wrist, the crescent shimmer brightened. And beneath Caleb's sleeve, unseen by most but not by the old healer, a matching light began to wake. The old healer saw the light beneath Caleb's sleeve and went so still that Grace noticed before anyone else did. He did not speak at first. Perhaps he feared the words would change the room forever once released. The nursery had only just begun to breathe again. Oliver lay warmer against the pillows, his small hand still wrapped around Grace's fingers, while the blue blanket rose and fell with steadier breaths. The court ladies had moved back. The guards stood near the doors. The snow outside had softened into a quiet curtain beyond the windows. For the first time since the accusation began, the nursery almost felt like a place meant for a child. Then the healer whispered, Your Majesty. Caleb's eyes remained on Oliver. Not now. Your Majesty, the healer said again, more carefully, your wrist. Grace felt Caleb's attention shift. Slowly, he drew back the edge of his sleeve. There, just above the strong line of his wrist, a crescent of silver light glowed beneath his skin, faint but unmistakable, matching the shimmer on Grace's own hand. The room went silent in a new way. Not fearful, awed. Grace stared at the mark, then at her own, and a warmth moved through her that had nothing to do with the fire. She wanted to pull her hand away, not from disgust, not from fear of Caleb, but from the sudden vastness of being seen by fate when she had barely survived being falsely accused. Caleb must have sensed it, because he lowered his sleeve again and stepped back half a pace. No one will speak of this as a claim, he said. His voice was quiet, but it held the full weight of the throne. Not in this room. Not in this palace. Miss Miller has just been accused, frightened, and used as a shield for another person's ambition. She will not be turned into another court matter before she has time to breathe. Grace looked up at him. The sentence settled over her more gently than praise. The mark still glowed, but it no longer felt like a door slamming open. It felt like a lantern set beside a path she was allowed to choose. The old healer bowed his head. Forgive me, Your Majesty. I meant only that the records of moon-blessed Omegas speak of a responding bond. Then the records can wait, Caleb said. Oliver stirred, his eyes opening a little wider. Grace stays. His voice was small, still rough with exhaustion. Grace leaned closer at once. If your father permits it, I will stay until you fall asleep. Oliver looked at Caleb with the direct seriousness only a child could manage. Caleb's face softened by a degree so slight most would have missed it. Grace did not. She may stay, he said. If she wishes. There it was again. If she wishes. No one in the nursery had asked what Grace wished when suspicion fell on her. No one had asked whether she wanted to defend herself, whether she needed water, whether her knees were shaking because she had nearly lost both her name and the child she loved. Caleb asked now, not with softness exactly, but with respect so precise it almost felt tender. Grace nodded. I wish to stay. The old healer began arranging calming herbs, this time testing each jar himself before using it. The nursery maids changed the bedding with careful hands. Someone closed the window against the snow. The ordinary motions of care returned, but everything was different now. The same room that had tried to turn Grace into a danger now watched her, as if she were a miracle. She did not know which gaze made her more uncomfortable. Oliver tugged weakly at her hand. Story, he whispered. Grace smiled through the last of her tears. A short one. She sat beside the bed, careful and proper, and began the tale he loved most, about a little wolf who got lost in a snowstorm and followed the moon home. Her voice shook at first, then steadied. The silver mark on her wrist dimmed to a soft glow. Caleb stood near the fire, silent, listening. Not to judge, not to command, just listening. When Oliver's eyes finally closed, his breathing even and peaceful, the room released the breath it had been holding for hours. Grace stopped speaking and looked down at the child's hand still resting in hers. She should have felt relief only. Instead, she felt the weight of what came next. The court would talk. The palace would whisper. The name Moonblessed would spread faster than snow melt in spring. Caleb seemed to understand before she said a word. You will not return to the servant quarters tonight, he said quietly. Grace stiffened. He added at once, not as punishment. The nursery guest room is warmer, closer to Oliver, and guarded. You may choose another room if you prefer. Grace looked at him, surprised by the correction. The feared Alpha King of the North was learning to make his authority sound like an option when it concerned her. The nursery guest room is fine, she said softly. Caleb nodded. The old healer watched them both, wise enough not to smile. Outside, the snow kept falling. Inside, the little prince slept. The false vial lay sealed as evidence, and the Omega who had entered the night as an accused servant remained beside the heir as the only person he trusted enough to follow into dreams. By dawn, the palace knew only the safest pieces of the truth. The heir had taken ill. The nursery Omega had been cleared. Lady Victoria had been escorted to council. The old healer had spoken the words Moonblessed in a room full of witnesses, and those words now moved through the corridors like candlelight under a closed door. Grace heard them before she fully woke. Two maids whispered outside the nursery guest room, their voices low but not low enough. They say her tears healed him. They say the king has the same mark. Grace opened her eyes to pale winter light and a ceiling painted with small silver stars. For one breath, she did not remember where she was. Then everything returned. Oliver's cold hand, the vial, the accusation, the silver glow, Caleb stepping back so fate would not feel like another court order. She sat up slowly, her gray dress folded over the chair beside the bed, her apron gone, replaced by a clean wool robe the color of morning mist. Someone had left tea on the table, along with lavender, real lavender this time, tied with a blue ribbon. The kindness nearly undid her. Not because it was grand, but because it was careful. A soft knock came at the door. Miss Miller. It was the old healer. The prince is asking for you. Grace was on her feet before fear could gather itself. In the nursery, Oliver sat propped against pillows, pale but awake, eating a piece of buttered toast with the solemn concentration of a child performing an important royal duty. His face brightened when he saw her. Grace. The sound of her name in his voice eased something inside her that no magic could touch. She crossed to him, stopping at the edge of the bed until he reached for her hand. You look better, little wolf. I feel tired. That is allowed. Father said you can stay. Grace glanced toward the fireplace, where Caleb stood in a black morning coat without the heavy cloak, his pale face calm, his storm blue eyes watching both of them with quiet attention. Your father said I may choose where I stay. Oliver frowned as if choice were an unnecessary complication. Choose here. Despite everything, Grace smiled. For now, I choose here. Caleb's gaze softened by the smallest degree. The old healer moved beside the bed with his notes. The prince is recovering well. The moon-blessed reaction continued through the night. No further trace of winterbane remains. Grace's wrist warmed faintly beneath her sleeve. She tucked her hand closer to herself, not ashamed, only overwhelmed. The healer noticed, but said nothing. Caleb did. You are not required to display the mark for anyone. Grace looked at him, surprised again by how easily he placed a wall between her and the palace's hunger. They will ask. They may ask the walls if they need something to gossip with. Oliver giggled softly, then leaned back, tired by the effort. Grace adjusted his blanket with gentle hands. The movement was so familiar it almost hurt. Yesterday, it had been ordinary. Now the same gesture had become something watched, measured, named. Caleb stepped closer, still leaving space. The council will question Lady Victoria this afternoon. You do not have to attend. Grace's fingers paused on the blanket. Part of her wanted never to see Victoria again. Another part, quieter but steadier, wanted the truth finished where it had begun. Will Oliver need me? Oliver answered before Caleb could. I will nap. Grace looked at him. That sounds very official. He nodded gravely. Royal nap. Caleb almost smiled. Almost. The old healer coughed into his sleeve to hide his amusement. Grace felt warmth rise in her chest, fragile and real. Then she looked back at Caleb. I will attend, but not to watch her fall. I want the court to hear that love for a child is not improper just because it comes from an Omega. The room stilled. Caleb regarded her for a long moment, and in his eyes she saw not surprise, but respect deepening into something more dangerous to her guarded heart. Then they will hear it, he said. Oliver's hand squeezed hers. Grace's family, he whispered sleepily. The word struck the room with more force than accusation ever had. Grace could not speak. Caleb looked at his son, then at her, and for the first time the cold king seemed uncertain, not of his power, but of the tenderness rising where grief had once kept him frozen. Outside, snow began to fall again over the northern palace. Inside, the Omega who had been accused before midnight stood between a healing child and a silent king, realizing that being cleared of guilt was only the beginning. Being welcomed might be the part that frightened her most. The council chamber looked nothing like the nursery, and Grace felt the difference the moment she entered. The nursery had held fear, but also blankets, firelight, and the soft proof of a child's life returning breath by breath. The council chamber was all dark oak, tall windows, silver seals, and faces trained to hide discomfort beneath formality. Lady Victoria stood before the long table in a plain cream cloak, no pearls, no polished smile, her hands folded tightly at her waist. The evidence rested nearby: the false vial, the switched lavender jar, the blue nursery cloth, the healer's notes. Caleb sat at the head of the chamber, cold and composed, but when Grace stepped inside, his gaze found her first. Not to summon, not to command, to ask without words whether she was certain. Grace gave the smallest nod. She had chosen to come. That mattered. The old healer stood beside her, and two nursery maids waited near the wall as witnesses. Oliver was not present. Caleb had made that clear before the session began. His son would not be used as a symbol when he needed rest more than judgment. Grace was grateful for that. Elder Rowan, the chief counselor, cleared his throat. Miss Miller, your innocence has been recorded. Lady Victoria has admitted to switching the vials in an attempt to remove you from the royal nursery. This council now determines consequence. Victoria lifted her head, and for the first time since the night before, she looked directly at Grace. I was wrong. The words were quiet, stripped of beauty. I told myself I was protecting the heir from attachment beneath his station. But I was protecting my pride. Grace listened, hands folded in front of her. She had imagined this moment during the sleepless hours before dawn. She had imagined anger, relief, perhaps even satisfaction. Instead, she felt the tired sadness of seeing how small cruelty looked once it stopped pretending to be duty. Victoria's voice shook. I did not believe the dose would truly harm him. Caleb's expression did not change, but the air sharpened. Grace spoke before the room could harden around punishment alone. You keep saying dose. Everyone turned to her. Her voice was soft, but it carried, as if the amount changes what you chose. He was a child who trusted the room around him. I was an Omega you thought no one would believe. That was the plan. Not the herbs. Not the vial. The plan was that his fear and my silence would be useful to you. Victoria closed her eyes. A counselor looked down at the table. Caleb watched Grace with still intensity, and she felt, not for the first time, that he did not protect her voice by speaking over it. He protected it by making room for it to stand. Grace drew a breath. I do not ask for revenge. I ask that she never serve near children, healers, or court testimony again until she has learned what care actually means. The chamber remained silent. Elder Rowan nodded slowly. A measured request. Caleb turned to the council. It will be entered. Lady Victoria Hale is removed from all nursery and court advisory duties. Her household will fund a protected infirmary wing for children of every rank, under the supervision of Miss Miller and the royal healers, if Miss Miller accepts the role. Grace looked up sharply. Your Majesty. Caleb's gaze met hers. You may refuse. The words steadied her. Choice again. Always choice when it mattered most. The idea of supervising anything in the palace frightened her almost as much as the accusation had. But beneath that fear was something stronger. A wing where no child's comfort could be called improper because it came from the wrong hands. A place where Omega care would not be hidden in back rooms until someone needed it. Grace thought of Oliver's small voice saying family. She thought of the crescent under her sleeve, warm and waiting. I accept, she said. The old healer smiled openly this time. Victoria lowered her head, not forgiven, but answered. When the session ended, Grace stepped into the corridor and found Caleb waiting near the window, snowlight outlining his tall frame in silver. For a moment, neither spoke. Then he said, You gave justice a kinder shape than most courts deserve. Grace looked through the glass toward the nursery tower. Kindness is not softness when it has boundaries. Caleb's eyes softened, and the silver mark beneath his sleeve glowed faintly, answering the warmth on her wrist. He noticed, but he did not mention it. Instead, he looked toward the nursery stairs. Oliver will want to hear that you are staying. Grace felt her fear return, but gentler now, braided with hope. And you? The question escaped before she could call it back. Caleb went very still. Then his voice lowered, careful as a hand offered palm upward. I will be grateful every day you choose to remain. Grace looked at the cold northern king and saw, beneath discipline and grief, a man learning not to hold too tightly to the first light that had reached his home in years. She nodded once, and together they walked toward the nursery, not as a servant and a sovereign divided by accusation, but as two people moving slowly toward a future neither of them would force. By the time Grace and Caleb reached the nursery, the palace had changed in ways that did not need banners or bells to be understood. Servants stepped aside for Grace, not with the startled fear they had shown the night before, but with careful respect. A young maid carrying folded linens whispered, Miss Miller, and lowered her head as if the name itself had become something worth holding gently. Grace did not know how to answer at first. She had spent years moving through corridors like a shadow with useful hands. Now the same hall seemed to notice her footsteps. Caleb walked beside her, not ahead, not behind, his presence quiet enough that others looked at Grace before they looked at the king. She understood the choice in that, and it warmed her more than praise could have. In the nursery, Oliver was awake beneath his blue blanket, surrounded by sunlight, toast crumbs, and a wooden wolf propped proudly on his pillow. When he saw Grace, his whole face brightened. You stayed. The words were small, but they filled the room. Grace crossed to him and sat in the chair beside his bed, the one that had been hers in practice long before anyone admitted it. I told you I would. Oliver looked past her to Caleb. Forever. Grace's breath caught. Caleb did not answer for her. He only came to the other side of the bed and adjusted the edge of the blanket with the awkward care of a father still learning how to make tenderness visible. Grace will stay as long as she chooses, he said. Oliver considered this seriously, then nodded as if choice were acceptable only because Grace was the one holding it. Then I choose pancakes when I am better. A laugh escaped Grace before she could stop it. Light, surprised, real. Caleb looked at her, and the silver mark beneath his cuff glowed faintly, answering the warmth hidden under her sleeve. This time Grace did not pull away from the feeling. She let it exist without needing to name it. The old healer entered with fresh notes and a smile he pretended was professional. The prince is recovering beautifully. The new infirmary wing will need a director with patience, discipline, and an unreasonable devotion to blue blankets. Oliver raised one hand. Grace. So I have heard, the healer said gravely. Grace looked at Caleb. The wing should not be named after me. Caleb lifted one brow. No, name it after the moon. If it is for every child, then it should belong to more than one story. Caleb's gaze softened. The moonward infirmary, then. Grace smiled. That sounds like a place children would not fear. Then, that is what it will be. Outside the nursery windows, snow began to loosen from the palace roofs, sliding in soft white sheets as the afternoon sun strengthened. The world was still winter, but less severe somehow, as if the cold had learned to leave room for light. Later, when Oliver finally slept, Grace stepped onto the small balcony outside the nursery. The northern air brushed her cheeks, clean and bright, carrying the scent of pine from the forest below. Caleb joined her after a moment, leaving a respectful distance between them. For a while they simply watched the snowfields glow beneath the pale sun. "Last night," Grace said quietly, "I thought my life would end in that room." Caleb's jaw tightened, but his voice stayed gentle. "I know, and now everyone is calling me blessed." She looked down at her wrist. The crescent mark shimmered softly, no longer frightening, but still impossible. "I do not feel blessed. I feel tired, grateful, afraid, angry sometimes, all at once." Caleb turned toward her. "Then feel all of it. A gift does not require you to pretend the wound never happened." Tears rose unexpectedly, not healing tears this time, just human ones. Grace let them gather without shame. "Will the court always watch me now?" "Probably." The honesty startled a small smile from her. Caleb continued, "But watching is not owning. Your gift, your time, your heart, your future, none of it belongs to the court." Grace looked at him then, really looked, and saw the effort beneath his restraint. The bond between them glowed quietly, patient as moonlight, but he held himself still because she had been given too little choice in too many rooms. "And you?" she asked softly. "Do you think any part of it belongs to you?" Caleb's eyes warmed, not with possession, but with something far more vulnerable. "Only what you choose to share." The answer settled over the balcony like snowfall, silent and beautiful. Grace stepped closer, not into his arms, not into a vow, only close enough that the silver marks on their wrists brightened in recognition. Below them, the palace bells began to ring for the prince's recovery, clear and bright over the northern grounds. Grace listened as the sound carried across the snow, past the towers, past the nursery where Oliver slept safely, past the council chamber where her name had been cleared. She was still an Omega, still Grace Miller, still the woman who had trembled beneath accusation and cried because a child she loved might not wake. But now her tears had become testimony, her kindness had become law, and her choice had become the first door of a future no one else would write for her. Beside her, the Alpha King of the North stood quietly in the winter light, waiting not to claim her, but to walk with her if she wished. Grace lifted her face to the pale sun and smiled through the last of her tears, no longer the accused servant in the nursery, but the healer who had given life back and kept her own.